Okay, so let's get right into it. Today we're going to be tackling a question that still has historians arguing.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Tsar Nicholas II, the ruler of Russia.
Yes.
Back in 1914, he seemed invincible. I mean, there's this famous image of him kneeling before his troops, holding an icon
Right.
of himself.
Right.
But fast forward just 3 years, and he's forced to abdicate. What happened?
Yeah, what happened?
That's exactly what we're digging into today. How much did World War I really contribute to the collapse of his regime?
Mm.
Was it the knockout punch or just the final straw for a system that was already on shaky ground?
Okay.
We'll be looking at this from every angle. We've got eyewitness accounts, expert opinions, all that good stuff.
Interesting.
Big shout out to Russell Tarr's work at www.activehistory.co.uk. His research has been super helpful in putting this all together.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
So where do we even begin with this?
Well, it's fascinating, right? Because at first, the war actually seemed to strengthen the Tsar's position. In 1914, public opinion was firmly behind the war effort.
Really?
Absolutely. People were rallying behind the Tsar, ready to defend Serbia and go head-to-head with Germany and Austria-Hungary.
It's that classic rally around the flag effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
When a nation faces a common enemy, they put their differences aside.
Exactly.
So did Nicholas II see this coming, this surge of support? Or was he caught off guard?
Well, some historians think Nicholas II saw the war as a way to kind of shift attention away from all of Russia's internal problems.
Oh, interesting.
Remember, he was dealing with growing discontent, calls for reform, even some whispers of revolution.
Oh, wow.
It's possible he thought a decisive victory would unify the country and really cement his power.
Risky move.
Yeah, it was a huge gamble, and as we know, it didn't pay off at all.
A gamble that backfired.
Big time.
Before we get into all that, though, let's paint a picture of Russia in 1914.
Yeah.
What was the situation like on the ground?
Russia was a land of contradictions. It was this vast empire, tons of resources, and a growing industrial sector. But at the same time, you had massive social and economic inequality, a very rigid autocratic system, and a peasantry that was largely impoverished and, increasingly restless.
So there was already this underlying tension. Okay, so the war kicks off, and Russia's early advances into Germany, they don't last long. They turn into some pretty devastating defeats. The battles of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes,
Brutal battle.
August and September of 1914, they resulted in over 1 million casualties.
Hmm.
That's got to be a massive psychological blow for the Russian people. What was the impact?
The impact was huge. That initial wave of patriotism, it just kind of evaporated, and it was replaced by disillusionment and despair.
Makes sense.
People started questioning the military leadership. Doubts about the Tsar's judgment started to surface.
So the cracks were beginning to show.
Definitely.
And speaking of cracks, let's talk about Russia's military infrastructure. You mentioned they were a growing industrial power, but it seems like their logistical capabilities were totally inadequate for a modern war.
Oh, absolutely. Their lifeline to the Eastern Front, the Trans-Siberian Railway, was just a single track line. There's no way it could handle the demands of wartime logistics.
Yeah.
Supplies weren't reaching the front lines. Soldiers were left with shoddy equipment. I mean, we even have accounts of soldiers having to scavenge for weapons and clothing from their fallen comrades.
It's horrifying.
It is.
One source even says the shortage of rifles was so acute that men going into the attack sometimes had to wait until their comrades had been killed before they could obtain weapons.
Wow.
It wasn't just a military setback. It was a total failure of the Tsarist regime to modernize effectively.
Right.
It speaks volumes about the deeper systemic problems that were plaguing Russia.
Absolutely. The war just put so much strain on every aspect of Russian society.
Yeah.
The Tsarist regime just couldn't handle it.
And then, in 1915, Nicholas II decides to personally take command of the army.
Oh.
What was he thinking? Was this some kind of strategic blunder or a desperate attempt to rally his troops?
It was probably a mix of both. Nicholas II, he had zero military experience.
Right.
And the historian A.J.P. Taylor, he put it perfectly when he said that the Tsar interfered disastrously with the war effort.
Oh, wow.
He completely ignored the advice of seasoned generals like Alexeyevem and Grand Duke Nicholas,
Oh, no.
just further undermining the army's effectiveness.
So he takes over the army, leaves this power vacuum back home,
Yeah.
and who steps in to fill the void?
Well, Tsarina Alexandra and, of course, the notorious Rasputin,
Oh, boy.
their influence just eroded public trust in the Tsar even further.
Sure.
Alexandra, she was of German descent, so people were already suspicious of her during a war against Germany.
Makes sense.
And Rasputin, this self-proclaimed holy man with a, shall we say, questionable reputation,
Right.
many people saw him as manipulating the Tsarina and, by extension, the Tsar himself.
It's like a recipe for disaster.
Hmm.
While the war rages on, Russia suffers defeat after defeat, and you've got these two controversial figures basically running the country.
Yeah.
What was the public reaction to all this?
Well, the public was furious. I mean, they felt like Russian soldiers were dying on the front lines, and the Tsar was being totally misled by, well, a German princess and a debauched monk.
It wasn't even really about the war anymore, was it?
Not at that point, no. It was about the entire legitimacy of the Tsarist regime.
And all this is happening while the economy is just going down the drain.
Yeah.
The war effort just sucked the life out of Russia's resources, didn't it?
Yeah, there were shortages, inflation, widespread hardship.
It was rough.
It was. And remember, Russia back then was still mostly an agrarian society.
Right.
Most of the population were peasants, and they were the ones hit hardest by the war's economic impact.
So you've got these huge defeats on the Eastern Front, incompetent leaders back home, an economic crisis crippling the peasantry. It's like a recipe for, I don't know, a powder keg about to explode.
It really was, and that's where the Duma comes in, Russia's parliament.
Okay.
At first, they were all for the war, supportive. But as things get worse and worse, they started criticizing the Tsar and his government.
So even though they didn't have real power, they became like a center of opposition to the Tsar.
Exactly. Rodzianko, the Duma's leader, he was the one who urged the Tsar to form a government of national unity, bring in some capable ministers who could actually deal with the crisis. But Nicholas II, he was so stuck in his belief in autocratic rule, he just wouldn't listen.
It's the classic story of a ruler totally out of touch, blind to what's happening around him. Was he really unaware of how angry people were? Or did he just choose to ignore it?
That's something historians still debate today. Some say Nicholas II was weak and indecisive, just a puppet for his wife and Rasputin.
Oh, interesting.
Others argue that he was stubborn and arrogant, clinging to his power even as his regime was crumbling around him.
Either way, it was a huge mistake.
It was.
And this brings us to 1917, the year of revolutions in Russia. 3 years of war, and things were at a breaking point.
Yeah. By that point, nobody wanted the war anymore. There are accounts from soldiers describing just mass demoralization, desertions, even cases of self-inflicted wounds to get out of combat.
Wow.
One soldier, he wrote in his diary, "We are tired of war, tired of killing, tired of being killed."
That really sums up the feeling, doesn't it? A complete 180 from that early patriotic excitement back in 1914.
Definitely. And that shift in feeling, it was happening back home too. The economy was in shambles, there was no food, cities were overflowing with refugees from the war zones.
What a mess. So you have this mix of people tired of war, economic disaster, political chaos. What lit the match? What started the February Revolution?
Well, it was a few things all happening at once. In February 1917, strikes broke out in Petrograd, sparked by bread shortages and price hikes.
Okay.
Those strikes turned into massive protests, workers demanding the war to end and the Tsar to step down.
So it was the economic crisis, the pressure of the war on everyday people that finally pushed them over the edge.
It was a big part of it. Don't forget, the war had messed up agricultural production, and the government's economic policies led to crazy inflation.
Right.
The price of bread, a basic necessity, went through the roof. People were starving, and they blamed the Tsar.
It's the same story throughout history. Economic hardship breeds social unrest, which leads to revolution. And the Tsar dissolving the Duma, well, that just made things worse, didn't it?
Oh, it completely backfired. He silenced the one way people could oppose him peacefully, so they were forced to take to the streets.
And once those protests started, there was no stopping them. The army, supposed to be loyal to the Tsar, they began to waver.
There are even accounts of soldiers joining the protests, turning against their own officers.
Wow.
The February Revolution, it was a spontaneous eruption of, well, everything.
Yeah.
Economic hardship, war fatigue, political oppression, and just a complete loss of faith in the Tsar.
Yeah.
It was everything that had been building up for years, and the war just sped it all up, acted as a catalyst.
So Russia definitely had problems before the war, but it seems pretty clear that World War I was what brought the Tsar down in the end.
It showed everyone how weak the regime was, made the existing problems worse, and created the perfect conditions for an uprising.
But what if Russia had stayed out of the war? Would the Tsar still be in power, or was his rule doomed anyway?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Could the Tsar have held on if Russia had just stayed neutral? Or was it all going to fall apart eventually?
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about.
Well, it's easy to think things might have been different, but, let's not forget about the revolution in 1905.
Oh, right, right.
Even before the war, Russia was a pressure cooker. Social inequality, a stagnant economy, and more people wanted political reform.
So there were already cracks in the foundation.
Absolutely. That 1905 revolution, that was a huge warning sign. The Tsarist autocracy was in trouble.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Do you think the Tsar himself understood how serious things were?
Some historians think Nicholas II was just completely clueless. Like, he truly believed in his divine right to rule.
Wow.
And he just totally underestimated the opposition. He thought making concessions would make him look weak.
Hmm.
He didn't want to share power. Maybe he thought he could weather the storm like his ancestors did.
But times had changed. This wasn't the 18th century anymore.
Exactly. The world was evolving fast, and Russia was falling behind. Industrialization, new social classes, ideas about democracy and socialism spreading everywhere.
Yeah,
The Tsar's old-school autocracy just didn't fit in anymore.
it was outdated.
Totally. Russia was at a crossroads. It needed to modernize, reform, adapt to the 20th century.
Right.
But the Tsar was terrified of change. He saw reform as this threat to his authority, like a slippery slope to revolution.
And in a way, he was right. I mean, maybe concessions could have bought him some time,
Maybe.
but it's hard to imagine the Tsarist regime lasting much longer. Those demands for change were just too powerful.
Yeah, he was trapped. To modernize, he would have had to give up some control, which could have led to his downfall. But by refusing to reform, he guaranteed those pressures would keep building until they exploded.
So World War I, it was the trigger, but the problems were already there, like a house of cards waiting to collapse.
Exactly. It just took that one gust of wind to bring it all down.
And it highlights how connected everything in history is. These events, they're not just isolated incidents.
Right. They're the result of trends, problems, and a whole bunch of factors all coming together.
Like in this case, you had Russia's economic struggles, the rigid social hierarchy, lack of political freedom, and the Tsar's stubborn refusal to adapt. The war just brought everything to a boiling point. It sped up the inevitable.
And don't forget, even if Russia had stayed out of World War I, it still would have been affected by what was happening in Europe.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The rise of mass politics, communism, those rising tensions between nations, it all would have been a challenge for the Tsar, war or no war.
So maybe the war wasn't the only reason for the Tsar's downfall, but it was definitely the deciding factor. It exposed all the weaknesses, made the problems worse, and created the perfect storm for an uprising.
And we can't forget about the human cost of it all. Millions of Russians died in World War I.
Yeah.
Millions more suffered because of the economic turmoil and political chaos. The fall of the Tsar, it completely changed the course of Russian history.
Absolutely.
Civil War, revolution, the Soviet Union.
It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, their choices, and the consequences that follow.
Exactly. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. Understanding how our world was shaped and how those choices led to both good and bad outcomes.
We've looked at the evidence, we've analyzed everything, considered the what-ifs.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Was World War I the final nail in the Tsar's coffin? Or was his fate sealed from the start?
It's a complicated question. There's no easy answer. But by exploring these questions, by diving deep into history, we gain a better understanding of the forces that shape the world today.
We've presented the information, the eyewitness accounts, the different perspectives, but history is a conversation,
Yeah,
It's a back and forth between the past and present.
absolutely.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into history. It's a fascinating journey. Until next time.
See you then.